Welcome to Corporate Baggage, where we will help you unpack, repack, and lighten the load. We're your hosts, Whitney Siders and Catie Campbell.
For nearly 40 years, we've been coaches, consultants, and leaders inside organizations and supporting global enterprises and Fortune 500 companies to help make those organizations strong and healthy.
If there's a hot topic in the workplace, you better believe we'll be unpacking it here. Topics like return to office, performance reviews, compensation, nothing is off limits. Like, subscribe, follow us, and drop your baggage in the comments so we can unpack it together and lighten the load.
The only thing that should be in your bag is your paycheck.
Welcome back. We have a fun two-part series here today. As always, we're going to help you unpack, repack, and lighten the load a little bit. Today's topic is on layoffs.
Did you say this was a fun two-part series?
Yeah, I don't know.
Fun for who, Whitney?
It's not super fun, but hopefully you leave with some. All of our episodes are really structured around hitting both angles, from the employee to the leader, but then also the aim is to give you some tools.
Right.
That you're going to use. So some of them fun, some of them maybe not so fun, but regardless, they're tools to help you. So this is a two-parter. The first part will be focusing on the company angle. So what we're seeing around how organizations are handling layoffs, what that looks like, what they should be thinking about. And then the second part is going to be all about from the employee individual lens of stuff that they could do to get ahead of those things, to set their mindset, to understand what that looks like moving forward. So let's talk about, this has obviously always been a topic for organizations. And I think over the past couple of years, of late this year, layoffs is in the headlines every single day.
It's in the headlines, and at the same time, I feel like it's more present and more like top of people's mind because it's in the headlines. But the reality is the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimate that upwards of 40% of all American workers have been laid off at some point in their career. So it's not like a new thing, but it is more visible in terms of just the traditional media outlets talking about layoffs by industry and sometimes by state or region. And then in the age of social media, layoffs are becoming more omnipresent because people in a couple different platforms, and we can name some of those too and what that looks like, are talking about being laid off and looking for new employment. They're live streaming their layoff. We need to dig into that a little bit too, just in the moment. So you almost get a real-time look into what's happening when somebody's losing their job. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about this in two parts, and maybe for this one just focusing on the company side, because there are a lot of implications for what the trends are that we're seeing right now for how a company should prepare for a layoff, do it really well if they're going to have to do it, and really just understand the issue from a couple of different angles so that they're prepared for it and that they're being intentional about not having to do it, but when they actually have to execute it, that they're doing it in a way that's really smart for the longevity and long-term health of their organization.
Yes. So let's talk about, before we talk about the way that layoffs are kind of carried out and the different things that we've seen from our clients, but also then in the marketplace. Let's talk about reasons why layoffs would occur. So I want to talk about that because a layoff is thought to be for this single reason, which is often financial, but that's not always the case. So do you want to talk a little bit about different reasons why you've seen layoffs happen and things that contribute to that?
How much time do we have? I mean, look, this is an issue that is extremely nuanced, but at a high level, one of the biggest causes of layoffs in organizations and companies is poor strategic planning or the lack of strategic planning from the get-go. So when you've got an organization that's singularly focused on things like top-line revenue or production of something or just certain sales numbers, and they're not thinking about what's our competition doing, how do we need to grow, how does our organization need to change, what would that mean for the workforce, answering what I think are pretty standard questions that would help to just start the conversation around strategy. When they don't have a strategy in place, or if they have a strategy in place, but it's like, a dusty paper on a shelf or a
Right.
file in the
Or
back
no
of someone's
contingency
computer.
or risk planning
No
included.
goal setting or metrics against that. When the organization's not aligned to the strategy, even if it exists, people are just kind of off doing their own thing, then you get over your skis on having too many people, hiring the wrong type of people for whatever capability or needs that you have. So one of the biggest things that I see right off the bat is either a lack of strategy and vision or a lack of adherence to the strategic plan.
Yep. How about around restructures too, which can often be elimination of role scenarios, but at a very, I'm thinking like larger corporate level, restructuring can also influence a lot of that too.
But you need to, I think you need to actually say what you mean around restructuring, because a lot of companies, when they're laying off people, will say, oh, it's due to restructuring. And that's
it's not,
like,
yes,
that's a
100%.
euphemism. What is that a
Good call out.
euphemism for? But when you're saying restructuring,
Like true restructuring.
look, what would that look like?
So to your there, and we'll talk about a couple examples of what you're saying, which is what's the narrative and the messaging that is good versus not helpful,
Right.
And people seeing between that, which I 100% agree. Restructuring is often used as a cover to poor planning.
Right.
Call that out. We're not saying that that's right. And there are true restructures that happen that inform layoffs that need to happen for the business. Now, does that still connect to poor planning? In some way, shape, or form, it always comes back to that. And at the same time, in order to get what got us here won't get us there. So if you're planning that your 3 to 5 year growth plan requires you to do X, Y, and Z, and that the structure you have currently doesn't support that, it's time to restructure and to start planning for that in phases. Now, if you're planning for that in phases, those layoffs look a lot differently. Now, that's not always going to be achievable to do it that way, right? So if you need to do a restructure, let's say you're in more of a small to mid-sized business and you need to do a restructure, it's less about the people and more about what you need in those functional roles. Thinking about the functional roles first and then where the people can go versus I have these people. So that then informs some layoffs.
So it's about capabilities and having the right capabilities.
Capability
for
and function.
what the growth
skills.
plan is and what the business is going to be in the future.
Right. That's the conversation around restructure. Often we see it where leaders say, I have these people, where can I put them during the restructure? And then they're restructuring a year later. And that's where we don't want to be, because that then gets to the point of having multiple layoffs year after year, or even sometimes multiple layoffs in a year. And so for restructuring reasons, that's a problem. You need to do it the right way first. For financial reasons and poor planning, that's also becomes a big issue when you don't cut enough the first time, you don't have the proper information to make those decisions, and that impacts not just financial performance, but the morale of your people, additional fallout, all of those things.
So
I hit a lot there. So
you
sorry.
did. No, but there's also just changing product lines or businesses, right?
Sure.
So we've worked in organizations before where we were doing one thing, we added a capability, we sold a capability. That's pretty normal. You decide that you don't want to do a certain part of your business anymore, so you sell it off. I'm working with a company right now that's done that a couple of times. Or they will restructure things on paper. So you could have, let's just say that you have one entity and it says, we're going to break off this division and create its own LLC around it. So if we want to sell it later, we can. So on paper, the way the employees experience it, it looks very similar. But if they decide to sell that part of the business, some of the people might go with them.
Right.
So I think, an initial piece of advice for companies when they're thinking about, okay, we're going to have to, maybe if we're going to have to lay people off, if it's for a restructure, it needs to be for a restructure. We're selling a piece of the business. We are ending a product line. We're starting a new product line, and we don't have the right people for that. I've also seen a restructure. I worked for a company once that really wanted to dominate the cybersecurity market, and they realized that it was too expensive to buy or acquire or recruit cybersecurity professionals. It was too expensive to go to the open market for them. So they put out an internal open call and said, if you want to cross-train into something else, the military does this all the time, right?
Yeah.
That you want to cross-train into something else, we'll train you for that. We'll pay you while we're training you. And then you're going to then be certified to be able to do something else. And they were highly successful at doing that. That was a complete restructure. They dialed down a part of the business that was no longer going to be a thing. And as opposed to laying people off, they gave them an opportunity to say, we can turn you into something else. We can upskill you somewhere else. And it really worked. So the company was able to avoid the mass layoffs that they normally would have seen. The people then got to stay in the company, so they didn't have to do a transition in terms of their employment. And they got an opportunity to go into a hot market and develop like a whole new skill set. Also, so all of that counts as a restructure. But I think when companies are in the process of doing layoffs, if they're talking about a restructure, like you should be able to look legitimately at the organization, all the sticks and boxes on a spreadsheet or on a slide or something, and say this part doesn't exist anymore, or this part got converted into this. Like a restructure actually means that. It's not just a euphemism for we got to let some people go because we have too many people.
Right. This is back to what we were talking about in our last episode around offboarding, which is at the end of the day, people want to feel like it's fair and just. And sure, that requires some transparency. How transparent you are doesn't necessarily, like, there can be some messaging and narrative behind that. And at the same time, not covering it.
Right.
Totally. There needs to be some transparency that will catch up to you.
Yep.
We've seen that happen a lot.
We've seen situations where, too, so away from restructuring, but really it's just having to downsize because the business isn't there. So you don't have enough revenue coming in to cover people and expenses. And so
that's a reality.
Right.
So let's say you're a leader in an organization and there needs to be a restructure, a layoff because you're selling off, you're not performing, or a true reason for a layoff. There's various ways to go about it that we'll talk about how it works well and how it doesn't and how we've seen it, how it's not. So
okay, you always make us start with the positive.
Yeah, let's do it.
No, I don't want to.
No, you want to start with the negative this time? Okay.
Well, okay, so you and I started talking about, we started talking about layoffs like 3 or 4 years ago. It was actually more like in 2020 because people were working from home. We've been used to working from home for years, but the nouveau thing was working from home, and a lot of people were really spending more time on social media. Like they were live streaming their life. A lot of the social media tools have made that more easy to do for the average person. And when companies would lay people off, they would live stream it. So there were a couple of situations. Better.com is still the one that I am annoyed about because they laid off like 1,000 people over Zoom all at once. Once. So not like, what we traditionally see, the 15-minute meeting with a manager and somebody from HR that says, Catie, you're being laid off, your position's being eliminated, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very standard, legalese kind of thing. That's normal. I don't think it's normal to be sitting on a Zoom call with 1,000 other people while the CEO of your company goes, yeah, so sorry. Thank you for your service. You no longer have a job. That to me is
the most empty thank you. Well, and this gets to the moral code a little bit of like what responsibility does the organization have? And I think our stance on it, at least, and what we coach our clients to is people first. Having that dignity, having that understanding, being a values first organization. So if you decide that you're an organization that does not believe in that, great, do it that way.
That's true.
I'm opening it up for the ability for us to make our own decisions as leaders. We're not saying that you have to do it our way. We're saying that we know that this works sustainably. It helps deliver more results. It helps get you the best talent. If you want that, lead with values first.
Well, look, if you are going to keep your company around, if you're laying everybody off and you're going down to 0 employees,
issues.
It's just like burn it down. But that's not what we're talking about. If you're intending to keep your business being viable, people are watching. We are just living in a day and age where from here on out, we're going to have visibility into everyone's day to day. So if you're thinking about, hey, we still want to attract and retain and the right people, okay, how you offboard people, and then if you're having to do a mass layoff, it should also be done in a way that really coincides with, the company values or the employer brand that you're trying to have. So if your employer brand is laying everybody off over Zoom, cool. But that also means that, one, I'm not just personally going to get my products or services from you if I know that you treat your employees like garbage. Like there is a winemaker, I will not name them, but there's a winemaker that I know personally treats their employees like garbage. I love the wine. It's delicious. I used to be a super fan of them. I won't buy it. Will not buy it because I have heard how the CEO just is a tyrant to his people. And I just am not okay with that. Other people don't care. They like slightly inexpensive wine and they're cool with that. I can't do it. But also, if you know that you could go to work one day and get laid off with 1,000 of your best friends at work in a very unceremonious fashion, are you really going to put all of your blood, sweat, and tears into that role? I don't know. Are you going to really be like all about the brand and wearing the company swag and, just waving the banner of that company? I don't know. Why would you? Because when you see things like that happen, what's the reaction? Like, what is it that you think they think about their employees?
They don't care.
They don't care.
They don't care. Yeah, and if I'm a leader listening to this and I might be thinking, well, they probably did it because it was most efficient, right? And they're choosing efficiency over
hard.
Right. It makes it harder. And so so let's just say we're not talking 1,000 people. We're talking 50 people, right? We're in an organization, you have to lay off 50 people. Is it faster to have a conversation on Zoom with 50 people than it is to have individual conversations with 50 people? Sure. But what we're saying is, what is that impact and is it worth it? Everything at the end of the day has a trade-off. Having the conversation over Zoom is the trade-off of time. You're getting that time back. Is that trade-off, you take that and compare that to the dignity, the impact on the employment brand, the impact on the people and their production, and that influence on business results. Hold those two together, and you get to weigh that.
I think that if you're laying off people all at once and you're doing it for efficiency's sake, you feel like I don't matter, I'm just a number. When other scenarios we've seen where layoffs happen and you're sitting in a Zoom room or even in a physical room with a manager who's not your manager and with an HR person or an outside consultant.
That you talked to once.
I mean, a lot of companies hire outside companies to help do this to keep, I guess it's cover your ass kind of stuff. It's to make sure that everything stays above board and legal. But you're sitting there with people who don't know you. If I know that that's the process that you take, now it's like, oh, I'm a number, or now I don't trust you. So I don't trust that what you're telling me about my performance or promotion potential or new opportunities. How do I know that? Because you don't even fire people or lay people off in a way that, the manager's on board and there's a supportive environment. There's none of that.
Right.
So now I don't trust.
And so the fallout of that is you're in that conversation, all of those things happen, and then what do you do on your way out? Most likely, you're having conversations with people who are having those same conversations, or you're having conversations with people who are still there, of which the company needs to perform in order to meet results.
You're burning the boats, Whitney.
You're burning them as they're going down.
Yeah.
And so, this is the poor decision that you're making. So let's flip that. So the other way of doing it is also the risk mitigation, thinking about, okay, I do need to do layoffs. We'll talk about the positive way to do that.
Yeah.
But for the reasons of, I'm identifying my flight risk. I'm having conversations with the people that I really want to pour into and make sure that they understand why this is happening, how we made the decision at the most appropriate level, right? But what were the factors It's much easier to understand a decision, not just when you understand why. That should be table stakes. It's basic change management, understanding why a decision is being made. But what were the factors that went into it? So why is overarching. Business performance. Okay, but what were the factors that we considered in order to make these decisions on people? Was there, even if you don't have to talk about people's performance, but you could say, we did put together a rubric to understand what that looked like so that they know it was thoughtful, is my point.
I totally agree with you. The problem that you and I both know, and this is why we come into organizations to help them work through kinds of things like this, is because they don't have a plan and a process. And when just what you just said, I bet you can visualize a small handful of current and past clients. If you said that to, they'd go, "Ooh, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could tell them all that. Can we tell them all that? Should we tell them all that? What if we don't tell them all that?"
And you know what we say? Well, what I say? Yes, let me help you.
Yes, because what we know will happen. As soon as you say, well, we laid people off for business performance. Okay, but I'm still here. So now I'm working away like, I'm glad I got a job. This is so great. And then I see the Q2 results and performance is down or flat. What do I think is going to happen?
Right.
Now I want to start focusing on every time business performance isn't up or everything's not perfect or we're not crushing our goals, we're just barely meeting them. If that, I'm going to be thinking about, am I going to be the next one to go? Because it's business performance, because that's what it.
And that's where transparency comes in the conversation around continued focus on what we're doing, how we're doing things, what's happening. And back to what we said in the last episode, which is, yes, and the mindset is you could get laid off. At the end of the day, I don't think anyone should feel, this is my personal opinion. I'll take this out of my professional opinion. You shouldn't feel comfortable ever. If you're feeling comfortable, you're probably in the wrong job. Because, and that depends on your personal preference on like what you want in a job too. But if you feel comfortable, you're either not paying attention to certain things or you don't care. And that's okay. You might want to just go to a job for a paycheck. But then you can't be surprised when you're laid off either.
I think one of the things that has surprised me the most and we'll talk about this in our next episode when we hit this from like the individual worker point of view, but you see videos of people going, well, you know, the state I live in, fill in the blank, is an at-will state, which I believe almost every state in the United States is an at-will state, which means any of us, if we're working for an organization, could show up to work and they say,
today's your last day.
Today's your last day. And they don't have to give a reason for it. Now, there are exceptions, there's protected classes, there's other factors that can go into whether or not the employer, they have the right to make the decision. Will they pay for it on the back end to compensate the person? That's usually the case. But I don't know that there is a scenario where the employer says, Catie, we no longer need your services here. And that there's not a government agency that can come back and say, no, you have to keep her on the bankroll.
No.
You don't have to.
No.
You don't have to. So the companies have, in a good way, they have the right to be able to reshape their workforce the way that they want to. But what we're saying is, even though you have that right to do that, if you're thoughtful and planful, open and transparent about how, when, why you're doing it and what comes next, you have a better opportunity to keep the people who are left engaged, to have a really good showing to the general marketplace about the health of your company or your product or your services, that sort of thing. Like, you can control your brand and reputation if you're doing things in a way that is just open and honest with people about, this is where our business is going and this is what we're doing. And that often means that some people have to go. And I don't think that's the end of the world. That is part of what business is about. But it baffles me that so many people are surprised that, like, I could just be let go on any given day. Yes, you can.
And unfortunately, this might come to a surprise as some individuals listening, but here's a little inside, is at the top, at the leadership level, at the executive level, almost every year, sometimes every quarter, those leaders, your leaders, are asked to cut budgets. They're not getting an email saying, you would get $1 million more this year.
Spend as much as your heart's content.
So it's either you need to cut X percentage of your budget, or you need to cut X dollars of your budget, or sometimes even you need to cut specifically X people. It's
Right.
often the latter two, right? And then it gets to the people aspect.
Yeah.
So to your point of being planful, you don't have to have a contingency plan for everything, but you should be, if you are a leader in an organization that has those conversations on a regular basis, you also should not be surprised when you're asked to cut budget.
Right.
So what are those things that inform that? What are some things that you should always have a pulse on your financial performance, those patterns, those things that are happening, your talent performance, what's happening and where those people are and what that means, and the future goals. Where are you trying to go? So what would that fallout? How would that fallout impact where you need to go? Because I think that's another thing that I often don't see leaders think about, which is, okay, I need to cut X percentage of dollars. Here's where I can pull. But they're not thinking about, okay, but that's going to impact our desire to grow the business in this way next year. So thinking in terms of, I think there are good leaders that do this, and it's not the majority, which is thinking in a way that is chestnut checkers. Because it's often a quick ask. I need you to do this by Monday.
I need you to do this in a very short period of time. And the other piece of this, and this is really hard coming from the perspective that we do business at, which is we consult with people, we coach people, right? We're very invested in the human side of work.
Mm-hmm.
However, what we're talking about is not the human side of work. When you're trying to lay people off,
it's both sides.
on one hand, it is the black and white exercise of making the numbers work to keep the business growing, thriving, viable, fill in the blank of whatever you want to call that. The other piece of it, though, is there's human beings,
How
right?
do you handle it? Mm-hmm.
How do you handle it? And knowing that, yeah, we need to have people in place to help the business grow, but sometimes you just have to let those folks go. And where a lot of leaders get tripped up, they can do the Excel spreadsheet, the number crunching exercise, but then when it goes to, but that means we're going to have to let Catie go, and we know Catie's has a mortgage and she's got a single mom, and oh my gosh, and what's she going to do? This is where it becomes really, really challenging. So having support in place and a plan in place for this entire layoff exercise, whether it's through restructuring or it's just a cost-cutting exercise to keep the business healthy, is really important. The other thing that happens after a layoff is announced and it goes is you still have a workforce in place. So let's just pretend that they're not sitting there going, I'm a flight risk, I need to leave. A lot of people start to feel guilty. I mean, the term that's often used is survivor's guilt. They feel guilty about not being the person that got picked because they start thinking about it from the human perspective. They didn't do the Excel spreadsheet exercise. They're thinking about, well, that was Whitney and that was Catie and that was Owen and that was Steve and these are my colleagues and we celebrated Whitney's milestone the other week and we were excited about Steve's new baby and now those people are gone. And why did I get picked to be here? Before they start to think about, am I next? They often start to think about but why me? And why that not them?
Yeah. And I think that's where the prep becomes so important because here's an example. If you don't have if you're a leader who doesn't have a strong relationship with your employees, that conversation is hard to make genuine and and tough to have with those that are having those feelings.
Right.
It is much easier to have vulnerable conversations, honest conversations when you've built a strong relationship leading up to that point. So this goes back to our theme, which from these last few episodes, which is if you're doing the right things leading up to a really crappy event like a layoff, it's still not going to feel great. But it could be worse if you're not doing those things. It's going to help put those things in place where you can have a really productive conversation because here's what the two scenarios look like. I'm the leader who made a bunch of layoffs. Catie, you're remaining, and a bunch of your colleagues that I know you were close to were left. We make the conversation. I say, I'm going to follow up with you after you digest that a little bit, and, we could talk. We have a really strong relationship. You come to me and you say, I'm really concerned about X, Y, and Z. I'm having these feelings about X, Y. I can address that versus those stories starting to spew in your head and you wasting time focusing on that. Or at the worst, thinking about where to go next. Versus, I don't have a strong relationship with you because I haven't invested the one-on-one time, and you are thinking all those things but not saying them to me. And then 2 months later, you're gone, and I say, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe Catie left." Then I'm stuck in a harder position.
It's because the relationship wasn't there. And you said something earlier about the openness, the honesty, the transparency that I think is really important in this scenario too. Because the third thing that we see when layoffs occur is that people just start to lose focus on work.
100%.
Because now they're not focused on the thing that they're supposed to produce or the customers they're supposed to serve. They're focused on what's happening with the business, what's going to happen next. And I think you and I both agree, that there's having awareness of what's happening in the business is important. Paying attention to a strategic plan if you get to see it, paying attention to company performance is important. But that's not the only thing, because and that's not what you were typically hired to do, right? The head of strategy is supposed to do that. People in leadership levels are supposed to do that. But what we see is when there's layoffs that happen, that the performance of the company continues to dip. It doesn't mean that people double down and they go harder. The final component that is pretty prevalent then is that people feel burnout, because even if you say there's a restructuring, there's usually some residual tasks and duties that need to be taken care of that just get reassigned to somebody who already had a full plate of work.
Right.
And that's a huge challenge. And so now you've got people who are experiencing survivor's guilt. They're not focused on their work. They're potentially a flight risk. And let's add to that, they're getting burnt out because they're taking on more responsibility, probably not getting paid more for it. It's a real challenge. And so this is where, again, companies having a plan in place, not just for how to lay people off and get them off the books so their numbers look good for their shareholders or just to help right size the budget, but really thinking about this as a longer term process that let's say that you lay people off the 1st of February. What happens then in March, April, May, and June to ensure the remaining part of the workforce continues to be in balance and very productive?
Right. I think all those points are well made, and we've talked a lot about how to have the conversation, things to do and not do. I think in other episodes, more so on offboarding, talked about the different functional ways that you can offer support in that way too. I think that's important to mention here too, which there's many ways to do that. Is, of course, severance is option. There's options, making sure people know their benefits and outlets of support and things like that. And there's ways to give some runway if that's a part of your planning too. 60 days, 30 days, whatever that looks like to help. And again, every nuance, there's going to be different factors that you need to consider. But considering those and the different options instead of pulling the rug, I think is really important. I think that also sends a strong message to those remaining too.
It's why it can be helpful to have just some outside counsel when you're trying to do this. And I don't mean counsel from the legal perspective only.
Right.
That is important to make sure that your HR people are supported, operational people are supported, and they're doing all the right things so that if somebody decides they want to live stream them getting laid off, even if you're doing everything right, you're protected. It is all over social media. People just almost taking pride in come watch me get laid off kind of thing. It's going to happen. So get your ducks in a row from a legal perspective for sure. But if you really want the company to thrive post a layoff, having somebody who's going to come in and really help you figure out how to guide and move
before, during, and after.
That's right. It's going to be so critical.
I think that's really important. And it's from the expertise level, sure, having done it multiple times. And I think that the perspective that I know you and I bring is that third-party view. You're not in it. You're not emotionally attached. You consider those things. We are always talking about people first. And we're able to bring that third-party perspective, that fresh lens to say, you haven't thought about it this way, or what about this? So we're really talking about the beginning, the middle, and the end of the whole layoff process. And I think what you're getting at too, Catie, is of course we're bringing, you and I, when we're helping our clients, we're bringing that expertise of having helped organizations do this and seen this in different scenarios. And it's not just the expertise, it's that third-party advisory. So being able to be in there and see different things, ask different things, and bring that third-party perspective that really helps in all of the work that we do, especially in the work around advising layoffs.
That's right.
So fun topic. ish, stay tuned for our second part, which is all about from the employee lens. So giving you a little bit of help there. Cheers.
Awesome. Cheers.
Thanks for listening today. If you have some corporate baggage you want to unpack or something you're taking away from the conversation, drop it in the comments.
Please find our social links in the description, and we'd love it if you could like, comment, subscribe, and share this with someone that you think it could help too.